You need to actually take Buddhist astrology seriously. Buddhists would schedule their monastic activities according to an astrological lunar calendar. They also included the planets as well as other factors of calendrical science and also the 7-day week. Buddhists always believed in astrology, but we don't actually ever talk about Buddhist astrology in like academic Buddhist studies. The emphasis is usually on the philosophy.
How would somebody start to incorporate East Asian horoscopy into their modern lives today?
That's a good question. When it comes to the East Asian horoscopy, well, first you'd have to understand horoscopy to begin with. The other part is that we don't have so many translations of this material yet, and I'm doing research on it and publishing on it, and eventually I'll translate some critical editions of some East Asian astrological texts. I think there's probably enough information on, for example, the Chinese almanacs, and some of that might even be translated, I'm not sure. So you would want to look at the use of the lunar calendar. It could be Chinese or Korean or Japanese. They're not all the same, but they have enough similarities because they kind of come from the same roots. And then I suppose you could look at that and look at sort of the daily auspiciousness of each day. Again, it's difficult to make use of this literature when it's not in English, right? Because most of it's in Korean or Chinese or Japanese right now, and I'm not really sure there's even like enough websites. I guess there's some websites you could probably find some of this. Again, as you said, I Ching, otherwise pronounced I Ching, the Mandarin pronunciation of that is I Ching. So I Ching has been translated, but that's not astrology or horoscopy. That's a whole other form of divination, right? So you're using the hexagrams and so on. But that's a very good art to study as well. And there's been enough translated on it. You just have to find a good translation of it. If you go onto a website called ctext.org, you can look at a lot of classical Chinese texts, and it has the English translation running under each line. So even if you don't read Chinese, you can actually look at a critical academic translation line by line. But that's the problem, though, is that just because we're kind of an evolving field right now, we don't actually have this material translated into English or any other European language right now. It's sort of like the Picatrix. Nobody really knew anything about the Picatrix until David Pingree produced a critical edition of the Latin, and then Christopher Warnock and John Michael Greer translated Picatrix Latin into English. And this was only like over 10 years ago or something. And now lots of people are very much interested in the Picatrix. And then this is evolving very rapidly because Christopher Warnock has a website and a course that you can do in the production of talismans. Yeah. Based on the Renaissance materials like Agrippa and other sources. And then Liana Saif right now is translating Gayat al-Hakim from Arabic into English, and this is going to be a very high quality translation. So once that translation is available, the practice of Picatrix, Gayat al-Hakim is just going to really take off. And so when it comes to the whole East Asian side, you need people to be able to translate this material, and it's just not so much available yet, unfortunately.
I'm really excited about the translations because what your papers and what you've described right now is that, yes, China had its own system, but it was able to take systems from India and also Persia. We haven't really talked about what came over from Persia, also from Hellenistic astrology, right? Like just all
Dorotheus.
These things.
Yeah, it was Dorotheus of Sidon.
There we go. And you mentioned Ptolemy as well. It sounds like that China back in the day, they were willing to mix it all up. They were willing to take what works and take all
they amalgamated things. So again, if you look at some of the medieval texts I've looked at, it's a combination of it's written in Chinese, but you have astrological and magical ideas from China, such as the 7 stars of the Big Dipper governing a person's longevity. You have the Navagraha, the 9 planets. That's an Indian concept. So 7 visible planets plus Rahu and Ketu. You have the mantras, so that's coming from India. Then you have ideas like the 12 houses, which is a Hellenistic concept, the 12 houses originally. And then you have the lunar stations, the lunar mansions, which in this context is connected to Indian astrology. So they had no problems mixing this all together. And then in the art record and the iconography, you have icons which are Indian origin and some which are Persian origin. And then, so what ends up happening is Venus is depicted playing a pipa or a lute, but she's wearing Chinese clothes. But the whole idea of Venus as a female goddess playing a stringed instrument is originally coming from an Iranian source. And you see that same icon in Arabic sources and then European sources, Venus associated with stringed instruments. Picatrix even says that Venus is associated with stringed instruments.
What sort of spin, Chinese flavor, were they able to keep when they brought in all of these other influences?
Well, from an astronomical point of view, they didn't use Indian lunar stations. The actual scientific dimensions, like the sidereal dimensions, they kept using 28 Chinese lunar stations. So in India, they have a lunar mansion called Kritika, which is around the vicinity of the Pleiades constellation. And then the dimensions of that lunar station is actually not the same as the equivalent in Chinese, which is Mao. And so Mao Shou, the Chinese lunar station, is used as a functional equivalent for the Indian nakshatra or lunar mansion. So the Chinese texts are using their own astronomical concepts as functional equivalents for the Indian one. And even when it came to horoscopy as well, they calculated things according to Chinese astronomical parameters. So we divide the ecliptic into 360 degrees, right? So 12 zodiacs, 30 degrees each. The Chinese astronomy historically uses 365.25 degrees, which is the actual time it takes for the sun to go around the ecliptic. The other thing that they kept, I suppose, with the astrology side was also Chinese native numerology. So that's like the auspiciousness or inauspiciousness of the day according to the cycle of 60 days in the Chinese calendar. So that the earthly branches, heavenly stems, these other factors that you have to take into consideration. Also, the in like the later texts too, what I see are references to the 5 elements. So earth, metal, etc. And so the Chinese 5-element theory, which is different from the Western 4-element theory, also was preserved and developed in China as well. And then over time, they actually forgot about the foreign origins of horoscopy. They just assumed that it had always been part of Chinese culture since antiquity. And it took some scholars in the 14th century a bit of effort to try to convince everyone that this was actually originally introduced from Western countries. Western countries as in being Central Asia, not like Europe.
The takeaway that I'm getting from this interview and from your papers is that, number one, Buddhism helped bring astrology in, which is very interesting because nobody would think that a religion would do that. Right. So that just shows the type of religion that Buddhism is and its emphasis on the auspicious timing of rituals, of mantras, of prescriptive things to help you in your life to work off your karma. You also mentioned in your papers that there were people in Chinese courts who were of, like Persian or,
Persians and Indians. They worked for the Chinese emperor, directly under the Chinese emperor. There were all sorts of foreign persons working in China. Like 14th century or 13th, 14th century under the Mongols when they had conquered China too, you had a lot of Persian and, otherwise Islamic figures who worked under the Chinese emperor, and they translated materials from Arabic or Persian into Chinese. China was a multicultural society historically. It arguably still is. I mean, you have lots of different ethnic minorities in China.
So the Mongols, they conquered China.
It starts with Genghis Khan and then subsequently Kublai Khan and the others. So there was a Mongol dynasty for about a century in China.
How did the Mongol rulers... How did that change the face of esoteric Buddhism?
That's very important because the Mongols also patronized Tibetan Buddhism. And there's a very famous Sakyapa Lama named Pagpa. He was patronized by the Mongols. And so the Mongols also introduced Tibetan Vajrayana into China in a way that hadn't been done before. And then later you have the Manchus who conquer or take over China in the 17th century until the modern period. And then the Manchu court also patronized Tibetan Buddhism. So then once you get the Mongols, you have Chinese culture intermixing with Mongolian culture, intermixing with Tibetan culture, and then you have the Arabs and Persians, and then you have the people coming also from Southeast Asia, migrating into areas in southern China like what's now Hong Kong and Guangzhou, and then also you have interactions with the Koreans and the Japanese. So I mean, East Asian history is a very complex tale to tell.
I think a lot of people would be surprised by that the conquerors weren't just like, we have our religion and stuff and that's it. Everybody's just going to follow what we say. Because we're used to sort of like, the holy wars and each religion trying to like win over the other. Whereas the Mongols were just like, well, we know of this groovy thing over here.
The Mongols were very tolerant of religions. There's like the indigenous religion of the Mongolians, but then a lot of Mongolians later, they adopt Islam, they adopt Buddhism. Some of them became Nestorian Christians as well. And so in East Asia, I mean, there were times in East Asia, like in Chinese history, where Buddhism was suppressed by the state, but it didn't last very long. And historically, East Asia hasn't had this idea that you have to be one religion. Like even to this day, I mean, it's very well known that you go to Japan, if you ask people, do you have a religion? They say, no, I have no religion. But then they go to the Shinto shrine for Shichigo-san. So that's 7, 5, and 3. The ages of 7, 5, and 3, you bring your child to the Shinto shrine to get a blessing. And then when somebody dies, you call a Buddhist priest to do the funerary rituals. And then you might stop at the Buddhist shrine once in a while when you feel that you need a blessing. But people say, oh, I'm not religious, but they do religious things. But that's the whole idea, is that this idea of your personal identity tied to a specific religion is actually a product of Abrahamic religions. And it's very common in the West. I mean, people say, well, you can't be Buddhist and Christian, can you? But then what you see in India, for example, is people will go to a Hindu temple, they'll go to a Christian church, and they'll also go to a Buddhist temple because they don't really see a contradiction between, participating in these different religions. Now, of course, people will identify as Hindu because it's a legal definition in India, but then they don't have any problems participating in religious activities with other religions. Historically, that was the case as well. And even in ancient Rome and in the Greco-Egyptian world too, you have figures like Iamblichus who, he writes in Greek, he knows Neoplatonism, but he also favors Syriac and Egyptian religion, and he says that we should recite things in Egyptian, not in Greek, and so you have this amalgamation of different traditions. And historically, it's always been that way. And I mean, you had like Roman patricians who engaged in the cult of Isis, and so Isis, again, she's an Egyptian goddess. And so there wasn't this strong idea of tying your personal identity to a single religion. And I think this is what's also happening now in the 21st century, especially in the English-speaking world, is that people, they don't want to tie themselves to one religion. And there's a distrust of organized religion. It's kind of stereotypical to say that's what New Age people do, but it's not just people who identify with the New Age. It's a lot of people, millennials, our generation too. I mean, they'll do astrology, they'll do yoga, they might have a shrine to Vishnu or some other divinity in their home. They practice tarot, they'll do some Buddhist meditation. They might even, it's so colorful, and we have the option to do that. There's less cultural pressure to conform. So we're probably just reverting back to the natural human state, which is just to amalgamate various elements of spiritual traditions and find something that's comfortable for the individual.
I totally agree with it, because it seems as though the dynamic nature of, like when the PGM was written, the Greek-speaking world, that's what it was called, but it was also Egypt, it was parts of Europe. So, and during that time, like there was a mishmash of cultures going on in that area, the same that happened in China. So, And are we not like at that point in history again?
You'll have like you said, the PGM. You have the Greco-Egyptian papyri, which are translated, which is ancient magic with Picatrix. With also there's Indian materials too that have been translated. So I guess you have to find something that works for you as an individual. In an organized religious framework, like if you're coming from a Buddhist tradition, they'll say like, well, the goal is liberation from samsara, so it has to be done within a Buddhist context. And usually people are concerned about orthodoxy and so on. So if you're following that Buddhist tradition, then the tradition itself will probably say it's unwise to amalgamate all these foreign ideas under one umbrella. But
what do Buddhist monks now, the average Buddhist monk, let's say in China or Japan, what would they say about Buddhist magic?
They wouldn't use the term magic, but the term magic is a very contested term, even in the English-speaking world, because what exactly it refers to. is a big question. Like, what is the difference between doing a religious ritual and performing a magical ritual, right? So if you're at a Catholic cathedral and they're performing mass and they're doing a ritual on the altar, how is that any different from magic performed, for example, from the Picatrix? In many ways, the word magic means unorthodox rituals, right? It's being performed outside of the confines of the strict religious orthodoxy. So, but what would they call magic? Well, they wouldn't use the term magic. That's the first thing. And in Chinese, like mofa, so that's a very negative term as well. It's like demon dharma or demon way. So they wouldn't use the word magic. But they perform rituals, and so they'll make daily offerings to the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas. They'll also sometimes do a ritual where they feed the hungry ghost, which is this tradition where, you know, you have these pretas, these hungry ghosts that wander around, and then out of compassion for them, you offer them food. There's a ritual component that accompanies this, and also some recitations that you do. So, and then they have mantras that they recite. There's actually things that you recite. In some Buddhist temples, like in Taiwan, when you're at the toilet, you sit down and then there's a sign and it says you're supposed to recite this. So there's an incantation you recite just to remind you that, well, may I, eject all this negative karma and all this negative deeds from my life, and may I become a better person, etc. So you're constantly reminded about the goal of your practice, your religious practice, which is to purify yourself and to achieve liberation from samsara and to achieve nirvana.
Probably one of the biggest things that's happened to China and East Asia in modern history is the rise and the takeover of the communists.
Right. Yeah.
And the communists were not about superstition. They were not about any religions or any sort of practices like that.
They've survived in China. And in fact, if you go to China today, there's plenty of Buddhist temples and Taoist temples. It's just that they're under the control of the central government. So in China, religion is carefully monitored and supervised by state authorities. But that being said, you can find plenty of Buddhist monks and nuns and also Taoist priests as well. And there's even Tibetan monasteries that operate, but they don't have the sort of sovereignty that they have in, for example, Nepal and India, where religious freedoms are guaranteed. Taiwan, it preserves a lot of the older Chinese traditions of medicine and divination and religion to a greater extent, because what happened was the communists took over China, and then the nationalist government, which was formerly in charge of China, had to flee with a number of people and their army to the island of Taiwan in the 40s. And then there was this idea that, well, eventually the Americans will help us retake mainland China and then we'll be in charge again. But that never happened. The Communist Party is officially atheist, but then there's a lot of Communist Party members who go to Taoist shrines and Buddhist temples and patronize these people. It's just that's not part of their official identity. So they can't officially identify with Buddhism, whereas in Taiwan, you can be a politician and officially identify with a Buddhist temple or a Taoist temple or be Christian, for example, and that's all fine because they have religious freedom and it's guaranteed by their state.
Asian politicians in general have often been linked with indigenous religious shamans or fortune tellers. And in fact, recently, the Korean president, Pai Mei, she was impeached. And part of the scandal was that she was associated, every politician goes to a Korean shaman, but the Korean shaman being a little bit too powerful in influence. I'm so sure that even in the heyday of the Red Revolution in China, the leaders were going to fortune tellers.
In India, I met some Chinese businessmen. Some of them were actually quite affluent because they came and visited our Buddhist temple and they talked to me for a while. And, you hear stories of major politicians visiting Buddhist monks and Tibetan lamas and making significant cash donations and asking for their blessings and getting fortune telling done, etc. So it's not so uncommon.
So I remember doing an interview with Dr. David Mason, and he's an expert in Korean Buddhism, which is very different from Buddhism in the rest of Asia. And he was talking about how the government has tried to censor him. As soon as Dr. Mason and his camera crew were trying to record shamans in the mountains doing their ceremonies, all of a sudden, the next day, the camera crews are not allowed to come back in, the funding is pulled.
I've never heard of that happening in Taiwan. In Japan, you can generally do what you want as long as you don't touch on the imperial cult. So, for example, archaeologists, especially from the West, are usually not permitted to touch any of the tombs of the imperial ancestors. And also, if you write anything that would I guess, critically overturn any sort of mainstream theories that can also be controversial.
If you had to choose three songs, three artists, whatever, three cultural pieces
Hmm.
to represent the sort of research that you do, the magic that you do, what
Hmm.
would they be?
My first song would be a classical composition by Holt. So he did a collection of songs called The Planets. And
Gustav Holt. Okay.
yes, and so I very much like the song Saturn in that collection.
Is Saturn like your planet?
He's my planet, yeah. I very much like Kronos. I like the icon and the motifs and the lore
Let's
surrounding
talk about this
Kronos.
because most Western astrologers are not about Saturn.
Well, the thing I like about Saturn is that he's a stabilizing force, but he's also a very hard teacher. The gift of Saturn is adversity, and normally we don't like adversity, but adversity is the greatest teacher in life because in actuality you learn more from suffering than you do from pleasure. You don't become an Olympic athlete by sitting on the couch enjoying yourself. You become an Olympic athlete by training really hard and long.
Right.
Similarly, if you want to become a very good intellectual, you need to study a lot, sacrifice a lot, and it takes years and years to cultivate the skills and the knowledge in order to become a capable scholar. And also, I guess at a deeper level too, so only the wise may negotiate fate, but then how do you produce wisdom? Wisdom is produced through experience combined with knowledge, and it's usually hard experience. So you also learn a lot from your own failures. So failure is also the greatest teacher, because if you succeed all the time, then you won't necessarily detect your own shortcomings. And if you see very successful people and you analyze their past, you can see that quite often they failed a lot. So the Wright brothers, they're trying to figure out aviation. They didn't figure it out overnight, right? Same thing with medical science. There's a lot of experiments you have to do before you can find a cure for a disease, and it takes a lot of time and takes many failures. In order to become a, I guess, tolerant and strong person, you have to cultivate endurance. And again, endurance is only made possible through suffering and adversity. This is why I like the lore surrounding Saturn, because he's a very hard teacher, but then this is how you gain wisdom. So, Saturn is associated also with profound occult wisdom, but also with longevity. I think even if you think of it from a scientific perspective as well, what if you want to gain long age, then what do you have to sacrifice? Well, sitting on the couch, eating delicious food. Saturn is usually almost always depicted as a thin, slim old man, and he's also been abstemious. So abstemious means not eating very much, right?
And not drinking a lot either.
And not drinking a lot either. Sort of excluding himself from social occasions so that he can focus on the labor to be done. So he's often depicted laboring, especially in the Greco-Egyptian tradition. He's harvesting the wheat. He's an old man and he has a sickle and he's harvesting the wheat. So agriculture is a very tough pursuit, again, but it also requires sacrifice. And he's also a god who isolates himself from other people. Now, you can take this to an extreme, because Saturn is a humorless, loveless god. But at the same time, that sort of balance is necessary for some people, because if you're very, I guess, jovial and Venusian in your orientation, then you might end up eating too much, spending too much money, and socializing excessively and not getting enough work done. And then 10 years later, you suddenly have $50,000 in credit debt. You're unhealthy, and all of your social ties really haven't brought you any success in life. So that sort of balance that this sort of influence brings to somebody's life, I think, is important. In ancient times, however, they didn't like looking at the malefics as potentially helpful because from a polytheist worldview too, you want to enjoy life as much as possible because it's short, and you want to avoid suffering and hardship. And you see that in Hellenistic horoscopy. They don't like the malefics because they're hard teachers.
But without Saturn, Jupiter keeps expanding until it becomes what expands with impunity? Cancer. So you need something to stop it and to put bounds into it. So I can definitely see why Saturn would be attractive. And especially I can see why a lot of Asian cultures might see Saturn as also being attractive. Longevity, discipline.
Well, in medieval China, the Taoists, they really liked Saturn because he governs longevity. And so they looked at the image of Saturn. So again, this is a foreign icon that's coming into China around the year 800. And the Chinese, for the longest time, have venerated old age. And it's always been a goal of Taoist alchemists to achieve immortality, but failing that, living over the age of 100. So they looked at Saturn, and they saw that actually as a god of asceticism and longevity, and they were attracted to that image. Whereas the Greeks, they saw old age as something negative and something to be avoided because youth and vigor were venerated. In Greek icons, the image of Hercules is venerated, not crippled old Socrates. I mean, people they venerated Socrates, but the ideal was to be young and beautiful, not old and wise, generally speaking. Whereas in East Asia, old age and wisdom were venerated above youth and beauty, especially within Taoism. And to some extent also in Buddhism too, because you have like a whole, long-standing, centuries tradition of venerating aged monks because they had accomplished much in life and they had the good karma to live to a ripe old age.
If you've watched kung fu flicks, like costume ones, you know that guy with the long eyebrow hairs, like that come down here and the long beard, and he's just like walking around with his hands in his sleeves, but then he busts out crazy kung fu moves. That's what they venerated.
In Kill Bill, Pai Mei. So Clifford Lowe, who's my friend, he pointed out that, Pai Mei is kind of a good representation of Saturn. So he's a humorless teacher, and he's a hard teacher, but if you can get through his curriculum, then you become a master martial artist. So that sort of tough teacher who doesn't, show any sort of pity or sympathy, and he's training you to become a stronger person. And I thought that comparison was quite suitable.
Busting Saturn myths and Saturn, unnecessary Saturn hate right there.
So the first song would be Holt, the planets. And then the second one would be Spiritwalker from the Cult. And there's sort of this high-paced ascent, and it feels like, ascension. And then the third one, because it just gets me pumped up and it makes me feel so positive, is John Parr, St. Elmo's Fire. Gonna be a man in motion, all I need is a pair of wheels. Take you out the field to the light and St. Elmo's Fire.
This is that song that was in that movie as well, right?
Yeah. And it was a number one hit in the 80s. Like a lot of 80s rock music, it's just so positive and uplifting, and it just gives you this message that, no matter the struggle that you're facing, you just have to face it head on, and then you can rise above it and progress.
All the songs, they seem to have a theme, and the overarching theme seems to be sort of that Saturnian theme of overcoming difficulties, using difficulties as teacher.
And enjoying the overcoming of obstacles. That's the other factor, is that success, the byproduct of success is satisfaction. I won't say happiness, because happiness is a very nebulous term and it doesn't necessarily mean one thing, but satisfaction.
One of the things that drives me crazy is Mercury retrograde is happening, so everything in my life is going to go to shit. There's a very fatalistic way of viewing things rather than taking ownership of it.
Well, the Stoics would just say, you have no control over anything external to the mind. The only thing you have control over is your will. And the will can only be influenced if it assents to impressions. And what that means is that if you have some sort of emotional state arising in your consciousness, it can only control you if you assent to it, if you agree to it. And that leads to this idea of eudaimonia in Greek, which is loosely translated as happiness, but it really just means mental stability. Long-term, consistent mental stability. And if you can accept fate and calibrate your mind to fate, then you will be at a state of ease. So if Mercury is retrograde or your life is going to shit and bad things are happening, the Stoic would argue, then you have to accept it and carry on as a virtuous person. So even in the face of hardship, you just maintain a right state of mind and continue carrying out virtue to the best of your ability. And that itself is a good life. That is the good life. And and the Stoics don't necessarily even take that to a higher spiritual level. They don't say it's for, the purposes of future lives or good karma. So in Stoic mythology, Zeus gives humanity a spark of the divine. He gives a piece of himself to humanity, which is our faculty of reason. And then the rest of the world is sort of confined to the tapestry of fate. And we're part of that tapestry of fate as well, but then we just have the advantage of having the faculty of reason. So that doesn't mean that you'll purge yourself of emotions. So the Stoic would argue that you don't purge yourself of emotions. You become a custodian of those emotions, so they don't control you. So these feelings would emerge in your mind, but you wouldn't become hysterical, and you wouldn't, damage yourself or, damage other people or say anything that would, cause you problems. So you have to always behave in a rational way. And then the Stoic would say, well, of course, it's rational to look after your children, look after your financial interests, do what's in your best interest. But then when things don't go your way, you have to be able to accept it and not become emotionally compromised. And this is what I really like about Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and so on.
Seneca, yeah.
Right. Epictetus is one of my favorite philosophers in all of history, actually. So, because he's very straightforward. He says, well, if I have to go to jail, I'm going to jail. If I'm going to get executed, I'm going to get executed. So.
Right. All the railing and pumping your fists to the heavens, asking why me? That doesn't really change.
So you can either go along with fate or get dragged by it. So it's your choice. But then the magical traditions say that, okay, well, we agree that there's a fate, but can we somehow change it or modify it or negotiate fate to some extent? And I think that's really important as well, because that's the whole history of magic, is there's this idea that there is such a thing as fate, especially in like polytheist traditions. There is this idea that the gods have their operations in the world, but you can negotiate with them. You can talk to them and you can tweak things so that you can get a better favorable result. And I think that's also a rational response, because you're trying to do everything that's in your interest. That's something the Stoics also emphasize. The Stoics emphasize that people will always just do what's in their interest. So that's the other Stoic principle, is don't resent people for the things they do to you. Because again, that's also becoming emotionally compromised. So resentment and hatred and these sort of emotions, if you become hysterical as a result of it, then you need to take a close look at how your mind is reacting to these impressions on your consciousness. And that's something Epictetus emphasized. It just, people will always do what's in their interests. And Marcus Aurelius points this out as well. Just people will always do what's in their interests. They think what they're doing is in their interest, and you think you're doing what's in your interest, and sometimes you conflict, and sometimes you fight. And that's just a natural outcome of lived experience.
If you try not to get too personal about it, when you have some distance, and I think that's what Stoicism is really good, and also Buddhism as well, learning how to create distance from your egoic self, and trying to get maybe a bigger picture.
That's something that Iamblichus also taught. So he was the Neoplatonic philosopher. So Iamblichus' basic idea is that the human person is half divine and half animal. And so, again, there's sort of the Stoic idea, so that there's this spark of the divine. So the faculty of reason and the will that we have is divine. And then you also have the animal component, which is our animal instinct. And so when we're compelled to do something from hysterical emotion, that's our animal component coercing us. But then the faculty of reason should ideally become the governor of this person. And so there's this idea of the demiurge in Neoplatonism, which goes back to Plato. This idea that that you have a intelligence that creates the cosmos, and then it filters all the way down to material reality. And then humans are in a unique position in that we're still part of this material reality, and we still have our animal component, but we have a component of us that can rise above that. And so we can become an extension of the demiurge rather than being subject to it. So instead of being enslaved to fate, we can become a caretaker to fate. So we're still riding along the currents of fate, but then you have a sort of custodial position above it, So you have some amount of control over it, but then you also have a certain respect that there's a divine order in place and you don't get to call all the shots. But then it becomes easier to accept what's happening in reality when you are able to realize, or at least position yourself as having a custodial role over it. And so that's the whole practice of theurgy, according to Iamblichus, is that you ascend material reality, but you don't reject it. So Plotinus said that, well, you want to get out of material reality because it's very gruesome and negative. Whereas Iamblichus had this idea that you use material reality as a sort of, I guess, a springboard to achieve, greater divinity and to become really at the same level as the angels and archangels, which is this sort of custodial role below the gods. So you become a disciple, or you become a servant of the gods. You're not a god yourself in Iamblichus's theurgy, but again, you have this very important role that you fulfill. And then ideally, I think this would lead to a state of mind where it's like the Stoic eudaimonia. You're going to try to do what is in the interests of, your community and the planet and so on, but you're not going to become emotionally compromised, because it's like a surgeon. If the surgeon is cutting you up, it's not going to help if he or she is cutting you up and they're crying and they feel very sad that, well, I'm sorry I have to cut you up and you have this disease. And if they're crying and spitting into the wound, it's not doing you any favors, right? You want your physician to be in a very good, stable state of mind so that they can, do their job. And I think the work of a theurgian or magician in the classical Greco-Egyptian sense could be framed in the same way, is that you're not doing anybody any favors by becoming hysterical or emotionally unhinged. That's, I suppose, one of the goals of the wise, in order to really have control not just of external reality, but also have very strong control of yourself and your inner life as well. So the inner life, again, it's going back to surgery. If you don't wash your hands before you perform a surgery, the patient is likely going to become infected, and all of your work will go to waste. Same thing too is that if you're doing spiritual workings, if your inner life isn't pure, then whatever you produce externally is likely going to fail, or at least not turn out into not going to have the best result from it.
Let's say that knowing all this and
Right.
and also knowing the research that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say that, like Saturn was going to be transiting your first house, right? Ooh,
Mm-hmm.
scary. How would you try to do astral magic in order to remediate that?
Well, the way that the Chinese text that I've studied suggests you would deal with this is you would create an altar for Saturn for the time period that he's transiting the house that's of concern. So that would probably be the first house or the eighth house, because the eighth house governs death and Saturn governs death as well. So if you're afraid that you're going to face a premature death because of this, then you do it when Saturn is transiting this house. And so that would require producing an icon, either on cloth, paper, or a statue of Saturn. In the East Asian system, it's an old man riding a bull. There's alternate icons also as well. Also making the offerings. So you give onto the administrator the fruits of their administration. So, for example, you don't give honey to Saturn because honey is Venusian. It's associated with Venus, whereas Saturn is associated with bitter and sour flavors and fermented flavors as well. So, for example, fermented foods such as yogurt, also things that from the Indian tradition like black sesame is associated with Saturn, and also spices such as cumin seeds. Cumin seeds is also a Saturnian food, and fermented, so yogurt, cheese, etc. Also, you could even look at Hindu texts for the mantras to Shani, which is the Sanskrit name for Saturn. And then this is the most easiest way to deal with these, disagreeable transits, according to the Chinese texts that I've studied and I've translated. You can actually look at some of my papers that I've translated, how this ritual is supposed to be carried out. You can imagine that some people got a bit more creative with it, and they might have created like a whole altar shrine, extensive offerings and other things. The other thing is that the Taoist text says that you're supposed to avoid music because Saturn dislikes music because he doesn't like merrymaking and happiness, right?
Oh, Saturn.
Yeah. And then also there's this idea that you're not supposed to harm old people.
You should never harm old people, but
You should not harm old people, but I mean, in medieval China, I mean, if you're an aristocrat, that might mean like don't go and like seize the assets of an old man. Because I mean, it's a different age, right? It's a different age. And then also in the Indian tradition too, they have the idea of remediation, which is like, for example, feeding animals with which the god is associated. So Saturn is associated with crows. So people will go and feed the crows as a remediation. So it's basically giving onto the god, God's servants, offerings, and so it goes up the chain of command up to the god itself. So you can, I mean, finding the animals that the gods are associated with is relatively easy. So that's a very popular practice, I think, even in the West. That's kind of come over through Hinduism, is this idea of, through Jyotish, Indian astrology, of remediation. So again, universally crows are associated with Saturn.
So if there's anybody in the audience who's going through a shitty Saturn return,
go feed the crows.
You go feed the crows. Oh, black sesame seeds. You know?
Black sesame seeds. Actually, well, if they eat them, yeah. Well, black sesame oil is too. Korean food actually uses a lot of black sesame seed oil.
They do, yeah.
It has to be black sesame seed oil, not white sesame. They're different. And with Saturn, it's actually red sandalwood, not white sandalwood, because there's a difference between the two. So you have to be precise. The traditions of astromagic, like Picatrix, Agrippa, and then what you see in East Asia, they're very specific about the substances you're supposed to use.
Where can people find more about your writing and your work?
And there's my blog, which originally started off as a Buddhist blog. It's called Flower Ornament Depository. It's been online for 10 years now. So half of it is Buddhism, and the other half deals mostly with my research into historical astrology. And so if you want the basic introductions to some of my stuff, look at the blog first. And then if you want the academic stuff, look at the papers on archive.org. And then I should have a book published, ideally late next year or 2021 at the latest. And then in the future, I hope to translate some of this medieval Chinese horoscopic literature into English for the first time. And there's a few of us. It's not just me who's doing this research as well at an academic level. The main obstacle now to conveying this to the Western world is it just needs to be translated capably.
I will actually link down as well to that blog post that initially caught my eye. And
yeah.
I think it's
titled... That's a good overview.
Yeah, that's a really great overview. I think the title of it is Some Thoughts About Eastern Horoscopy.
Yeah, thoughts on East Asian horoscopy, I think it is.
So I'll definitely link down to that below. And Jeffrey, thank you so much for spending all this time discussing...
Oh, this is my pleasure. This is a great way to spend Sunday afternoon. I was very happy to talk to you.